to say something about the Kubota GST because my boys came in. Well, nothing I could do about that. Debbie and the boys come back from the dog park. Well, then it's time for me to go. Got to take care of my ibuprofen here. I'll take that when I get back out. Now, the Kubota GST, they call it a glide shift transmission. It's still a shifting transmission. It's one I ran into years ago when Kubota started playing around with something other than gear train or even hydrostat like they had in the small tractors. We're talking years ago, like the late 1980s, mid 1980s. When was that? 88? I think somewhere around 88, 89 I ran into it. Yeah. Trying to run into the dealers I had there. They were unscrupulous, sleazy. Just, they'd start doing things that I didn't want to be a part of, because every time I went out in the field, and I told them when I left, I said, every time I go out, all I hear is about somebody screwed them. They charged them on a Marine Midland farm plan, which is kind of like a farm credit card account thing. And then they'd put it on the store account. And the wives were catching this stuff and going nuts. Well, I get there and he chews me out, she chews me out, and then sometimes the farmhand would chew me out. Well, after a couple of years of that, it was time to get out. Somebody else said, if you're getting paid well, why'd you care? I said I cared because my name's attached to it. There's a lot of stuff like that that wouldn't happen if more people decided not to have their names attached to it. Hey, buddy. Jack coming in to see what I'm doing. So what's the idea of the Kubota glide shift? Internally, I don't remember if it had synchronizers. That's the one question. I'd have to get in there and look it up. But essentially what Kubota glide shift was, they put a hydraulic cylinder at the end of the shift rails. And when you shifted, it hydraulically shifted the gear transmission. Now you would think, I can't remember because there's a lot of the foreign stuff where they didn't put in synchronizers. What they put in was similar to an old motorcycle. They put in a dog clutch. No, what's a dog clutch? Well, it's something that's large, big, and it can take slamming. And I think that's what Kubota did to avoid. Because synchronizers, if you're shifting a lot, synchronizers are a problem. Okay? And you say, well, on the road, they don't. Yeah, on the road. But when you're on a tractor and you're slamming back and forth, forward, reverse, and loaders and such, they wear out fast. You don't believe me? Ask any John Deere 3020 8-speed gear shift guy. I said, what do you mean? Well, in your lower gears, before you get into 7th and 8th, and I think even 5th and 6th, they take out reverse. But even there you start to have trouble because why? Your first two quadrants have reverse high, reverse low, or reverse low and reverse high. Well, what's the deal? First and third are in this quadrant, 1 and 3. And then there's reverse. They're all synchronized. So when you're in a loader, you can, pop right back and forth and not worry about grinding gears much. But because it's in a tractor and larger, they tend to take those brass rings and expand them. Yeah. Hi, guys. Thanks for stopping by. And they become problematic, and the John Deere owners got used to the fact that you couldn't shift on the go anymore. You had to clutch it, and it shift just like a car transmission. You had high, low, and reverse. So what was 1, 3, and reverse? Well, 1 was high, 3, low, 1, and then reverse. They were all synchronized. Well, yeah, but I got 8 speeds, man. Yeah, then you get down, go back over, pull it down. Now you're in range number 2, which is a straight gear shift. You have to stop to make that one. Now you go into the next quadrant. 2, 4, reverse high. Well, now you have to go over here and you're going into your range shifts. 1, 2, 3, 4. So that's how you get into 5 and 6, 7 and 8. And that's how the differences is on a John Deere. And the only place that they had any synchronizers is in the high, low, and the reverse of each of those sections. Over here, that's your 1 through 3, or 1 through 4 of your gear shifts, direct gear, shifting collars. And it was all on a cam shifter, which is the freaky setup to begin with. And if you wanted to make any repairs with the cam shifter, you're going to tear the transmission apart, so get ready. Everything comes out, except the counter shaft. It's a mess. But anyway, So what's a Kubota glide shift? If I remember correctly from a guy that was teaching some of it to me while I was working on it, was a Kubota glide shift has the dog clutch. They're big, they're heavy, they're cumbersome but they're designed to hit and engage safely, so you don't need a synchronizer, and they're far more reliable. They're just not smooth. So you can go along like a power shift, crash, 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 and the transmission is built for it. Hydraulic shifting, that's a one lever inline shift. Well, Deere kind of had that with the cam shifter, didn't they? I wonder why Kubota didn't go manual. I think they didn't go manual because with hydraulics you have a little bit of a controlled delay. They can put an orifice in there and control how fast the shift actually happens. And the shifts are different. I remember driving the first one of those years ago. I can't remember. I think it was 6-speed or 8-speed. Big old quadrant arm out in the fender. But let me tell you, some of those shifts, it seemed like something was wrong. And the one guy says, nope, you drove it right. You did pick out the bad shifts. But that's the way they build them. I'm like, well, okay. There are some of them that were pretty jumpy. But the glide shift was a relatively tough transmission. So you had the glide shift plus the shuttle. So you could go driving around the field doing whatever you're doing, shifting up and down, and then you had the shuttle for forward and reverse to run a loader. And that generally in a geared transmission was synchronized. So Kubota now, let me tell you, there's not much that isn't a hydrostat in the Kubota line anymore. And for good reason. They got them down pretty good. They brought them up to about 3,000 hours before they have to have much work done to them at all. And on lawn and garden stuff and even a light hobby farm, that's more than enough. As sad as it sounds, that's more than enough. But you start getting up into the heavier agricultural stuff, gears and clutches, baby. Gears and clutches. They even synchronized a lot of them. But there, they have a shuttle shift designed specifically for it. So if you're going to be in forward, then your synchronizer, everything's engaged and you're not jamming between the two unless you're there spending time running the loader. But if you're doing field work, you're going to be shifting over here with the other stick. So, and that one, they know you're not going to be under load shifting it, and they often have a high-low shift over here. So, and some of them have a hydraulic reverser. There's different combinations that you can buy of them. All the way up to the M7 is Kubota. And I think some of the M7s might have Cummins in them, but most of them, everything is Kubota. You get to the M8, now you're talking an actual real full-fledged Canadian-built solid farm tractor. Versatile is building a tractor for Kubota with Kubota tin and Kubota guts in it. They tried putting Kubota engines in. No. Kubota couldn't get the longevity out of their engines, and they would have had to build a whole new series. So last I knew, they are Cummins engines, so you probably be able to use Insight or some form of Insight to actually do your diagnostics on that, which I believe I have in my ag program here. But anyway, I figured I'd throw that out there because I forgot the GST, and I was checking to see if the other live that I had done had gone in and finished processing. Well, it's nowhere near done processing. I don't know why, but that's all right. But anyway, that's the Kubota GST. I can't think of any other companies that did something like that. Most everything was straight stick down in there. Now, if you want to go back a few years, Ford had a dual power, which is just a 2-speed high-low shift. Alice Chalmers had several different style power directors. The original that everyone knows of, the big long handle, was a hand clutch, double hand clutch, high and low speed. And the oddball part about it was, normally the clutches are on the input side to keep the torque down. Well, this is on the input side of the transmission, not the power director. The power director gears had high and low. When you engaged the final clutch, there were 2 clutches, high and low, and they changed the speed going into the main 4-speed transmission. But it also gave you live power. People keep saying, there's no live power in an Alice. There's no live power in an Alice. There's no live power in an Alice. I put that thing in neutral and it creeps. Well, if it does creep, it's out of adjustment or it needs repair. That is your live power. And stop. Just stop. At this point, if you're arguing with me, you're ignorant. And please listen carefully. If you have a live power clutch anywhere else that's hydraulic, the same problem exists, except it's with a PTO that never shuts off instead of the transmission that's doing the creeping that you can control with a foot clutch and a gear shift. Got my point? And Alice was working like other companies were because our feds were getting out of control back in the 40s and 50s, looking for extra safety measures on farm equipment. And Alice and a few others, not many, but a few others, had a foot clutch. Ferguson Ford had a dual two-step clutch, but it was a similar idea. Alice's main flywheel clutch was the same one they'd had for years, so they didn't have to make any changes. You hit the foot clutch, everything goes dead. Transmission, PTO, it just stops, especially if you hit your brakes. So the idea with everyone else, independent PTO, is totally independent of transmission, foot clutch, anything. So there's transmission PTO, the foot clutch stops everything immediately. There is live PTO, which is your two-stage clutch, or as in Alice Chalmers' case, they have several clutches to disconnect the drive line to give you live power, so that you stop your forward motion, but your PTO continues to go. It's a little hoogy on some of their machines, but still, you have live power. You can stop or feather feed your machine independently of the PTO speed. So why isn't that independent? Well, because it's live. It's not totally separate from the transmission. The two are still working together. The power's still going through the transmission. They just interrupted it somewhere else. In the actual hand clutch power director case, they disconnect both clutches in front of the transmission. And power is still going out the bottom. And the foot clutch can still stop the PTO instantaneously. So there'd be no power to anything when you hit the foot clutch. It seems odd and weird, but that's how that's designed to work. What's a PTO clutch for then? Analysis. Well, that's kind of odd. I ran into a 190 XT that had no PTO clutch. They still had live power. To them, the PTO clutch was something to fail. It just had a shift collar in there. PTO on, PTO off. That's it. The gears turn constantly, just like they do with the PTO clutch underneath the belly in the exact same area. Yeah, right there behind the flywheel. Big old box in there, It's like 10 inches by 10 by, 6 or 7? Full of a nice big old clutch disc, clutch package in there. And that had enough failures in it. Oh, to say, what did that do? The only thing that did was, while you're moving, you can turn your implement on and off. You can do it with the other one, but you can turn this one on and off with a load. So you have that a little bit more flexibility. Is it flexibility worth it? Well, the fellows I knew there, Martin and Chris Wilcox, said, not really. And they said it was one less thing to go wrong. True story. So I had to fix his 180 and 185 both. Little bearing in the front kept going bad on the Alice's once they hit about 3,000 or 4,000 hours. Nobody wanted to change their oils, and when they did, they didn't drain the oil out of the PTO clutch housing. So even after they drained everything, you didn't drain the PTO clutch housing, which didn't drain all of the power direct oil, which meant that when you went to refill, that's right, you had old oil fumbling around in your PTO clutch for quite a while until it all mixed. So poor service is what the problem there was. But the bearing was smaller than it should have been, but it was for a reason. Didn't have a lot of space there. So that's how that one works. So your GST with the Kubota, no, you would have had a transmission clutch model there. But just, there's no neutral there unless you have your neutral in your little shuttle shift. But that would have to be hydraulic, so that while you were going along, you put the thing in neutral, stop your drive line, and let the PTO roll. Anyway, I figured I'd throw that out there so that I could say I did cover the GST. And it's right after the other one, and hopefully the two of them will process and be done. Coming up on 15 minutes, and hopefully that description helps some of you. When you go to make a decision buying a tractor, and I'm going to say this to my chagrin on one hand, because the New Holland tractor is not what the Ford tractor used to be, period. If you can find a Genesis tractor of any model, whether it's a Versatile or Ford or New Holland, the Genesis series of tractors, Genesis engines, were legendary. Absolute legends. I ran into a Genesis motor in a case tractor, a 190, MX 190, I think. when I got through working on that and figuring out all of its problems, that the power in that engine was just, for a what was it, 458, I think, 456. It's astronomical compared to any other tractor of that size. I mean, you're pumping out 200 horsepower on the PTO anyway at this point. That's how most of those are rated. And then you had torque rise well beyond, I mean, 200, 250, nothing. Nothing for that engine. The old 401, I know a guy that turned a screw and hit 250 faster than he could get back to the screw to turn it down. He said he turned it and all of a sudden it just took right off. He said they thought he was going to flip the dyno. True story. So, I mean, get into those older tractors without emissions. They have a couple of flaws. One of them is their fuel system isn't set up very well with the fuel lines. It doesn't have a big enough fuel filter, but if you change it often enough, that's irrelevant. Change your fuel filters every oil change, if not before. And the other one was it's a waste-gated turbocharger on those engines and many others of the era. And what's a wastegate? Well, a wastegate is just that. It's a gate that wastes exhaust pressure. The point is, when you reach a certain boost pressure on the intake manifold of fresh air coming into the engine, they only want so much. You get too much more and you start getting trouble like I caused one time in a Cummins. I'll describe that in a minute. So when it reaches, say they only want 15 pounds coming into the intake manifold, well, there's usually a little bit of blurp to it, bubble. But when it gets to 15 pounds, it starts to open the chamber or push on a little solenoid chamber, a diaphragm type of thing, pushes a rod. The rod goes down to a little lever, opens a valve, and the exhaust gases bypass and goes straight, from coming up out of the manifold just before it gets to the turbo vane. It just goes straight right into the exhaust pipe. What are they wasting it for? Because they have to waste gate. They only want so much pressure going in because after that, the turbo becomes so totally inefficient, the engine will start to do funny things like back up on exhaust pressure and overheat. And the other one was that I'll describe to you that they came out and told me and described to me how to adjust a wastegate and a turbo when I was at Cummins Northeast years ago, about 1998, 99, somewhere in there. So old Kim, he comes out of the office and describes it to me. I said, that's it? I said, yeah. Okay. So 16 to 24 or 20 some thousands, 40,000, something like that. He says, yeah, you can go higher, but that's pretty much what they want. Okay. So I went and adjusted it. Well, next day they come out and said, how did you adjust that? And I said, I put it in a range like you want. It was like 35 thousandths or something like that. I don't know. I opened it up. Then all of a sudden Harry starts laughing. He says, yeah, but how did you adjust it? So what do you mean? You said 25 pounds of pressure. Yeah. So when it got to 25 pounds of pressure, I set it so that's all it would open was 30 some thousand, 40 thousandths. He turned and said, I told you. Excuse me. I set it as a limit. It was supposed to be set as the beginning. When you hit 25 pounds, it's open 16 to 40, 60 thousandths, whatever. Someplace in that range. You hit 25, it starts to open. That wasn't supposed to stop there. They come back to the shop. They brought it back in. They had to readjust the turbo or one of the other shifts. I can't remember what it was. And they readjusted the wastegate and the turbo so it was proper. But they said, man, can you do that to the rest of the fleet? Like, what do you mean? He says, well, we do it with the rest of them, but it blew a quart of oil out in the ground. And he says, boy, what a fog behind the bus. How did it do that? It did that because the pistons and rings are designed to hold so much pressure in the cylinder. The way I did it, their actual pressure in the turbo, because of the RPM and being in an automotive application in a school bus, it would run up around 4,200 RPM. So it wasn't blowing out the exhaust like a tractor. It would have cracked open and stopped there and been okay at 2,500 RPM or less. Well, 2,800 on some things, but this one's up at 4,200. And it was still climbing, and that hole wasn't big enough to continue to relieve. So the pressure in the cylinder got so high that the rings didn't know what to do. So the pressure inside the ring was as high as the pressure outside the ring, and they started to flutter. It would blow by right into the bottom. In other words, it had too much pressure before the injector fired. He said, man, that was cool. I said, what do you mean? Well, I'm sitting there in the driver's seat and I mash it to change lanes. It shifted and the front end came right in the air. I couldn't see the lane in a school bus. So it took a 190 horse engine up to something, well over 250 in a little BT. Oops. And if the pistons aren't designed for it, that's a problem. Compression is the main secret. The lower the boost or down into NA, the compression will go up several full marks, not just points. It's not like it's going from 14.5 to 14.6 or 7. They'll start out naturally aspirated around 14 or 15 to 1, and it might go up to, turbocharged, they might run 14, 15 to 1, and then naturally aspirated, they may run it up as high as 19 or 20 to 1. Well, then you pump all that air in there, then it's packed in, you get the equivalence of the same pressure or higher pressure than the naturally aspirated. It gets, but they came back, wow! So there's your lesson for today, glide shift and such. But I love the work that I've done over the years. I got some great memories of the work and the customers. Some of the bosses and managers I've had, not so much. Why? Because they all had, all but one or two actually. There's Johnny Rush and Jeff Cole, I think his name was. He came from me, FEMA, and he sat there and looked at me and he says, you remember what you told me when I started here? So what, about FEMA? Or I said something else, and he says, no, the one about FEMA. I said, oh yeah, I remember that. He says, all right, well, let me tell you. I said, you probably heard by now that I'm leaving in a couple of weeks. Yeah, I heard that. And he says, okay. He says, you were right. I'm leaving this company, which was Anderson Equipment, mainly out of Syracuse, was our parent branch. It was bad enough at the Crystal Palace down in Bridgeville, Pennsylvania. But when it came through Buffalo and then came through Syracuse, by the time it got to us, it was nothing short of absolute verbal abuse every day. And if something went right, they were looking for something wrong, especially through the sales department. They were angry about everything. I can't remember the guy's name. Tom something or other was a branch manager, and then there was that jackass Jerry Skiff, and then his cohort after that, Andy Nether Croc or something, like whatever. But anyway, those guys just ran their mouths all the time. Somebody was wrong and nobody found it yet. Nothing could go right. They made sure nothing went right so they could go back to the Crystal Palace on their big meetings, or at least to Buffalo, and tell them, I'm looking out for you. I found something wrong. And that's how the company was designed. It wasn't designed for something to go correctly. Another one I ran into was just stupid. I sat there and said, if you'd have said something, I could have fixed it for you. And they said, what do you mean? Well, the guy was mad. He didn't want. There were 3 tractors to sell him of the variety he wanted. The only 3 production models of a white workhorse 185. 3. One was at the factory. The other was headed out west. And we had the only one on the East Coast. Had a customer that wanted it. And he didn't want the same tractor. He wanted a new tractor, not a demonstrator. He couldn't get it through his thick head that he'd have to wait probably 6 months to a year to get the tractor. But that they were going to sell him this tractor, and they tried making changes so it didn't look the same. Turned around and took the tractor back, made a few small changes, and then delivered it to him. And they were telling him directly it was not the same tractor. They were talking about even replacing the hour meter. I mean, there was just some of the stuff they were doing, but they didn't say a word to me. And he says, yeah, I just didn't want it to be the same tractor. So what do you mean? This is the same tractor that put the power out for you. You aren't going to get a better tractor. They better not. And he went off. And says, no, it's not the one. It got changed. Okay, didn't know that. Later on, he said, what'd you say that for? You're not supposed to say anything. I said, did any of you idiots, from Dave Andy, Robert Teaspoon, down to, unfortunately, Ken Sager, did any of you idiots think to tell me? Because I could have sat there and said, you know what? I really don't know. Or I could have said something even better. It's not for me to say. I'm not involved in the sale. He said, well, yeah, but coming from you, that would have meant that I wasn't involved in the sale or the tractor. Well, yeah, but He's looking for honesty from you. Yeah, he is, isn't he? And my word to one of them was, stop playing games! We would have lost the sale. No! You give him a few bucks off, he'll take it. The father and father-in-law, those two guys came in and he says they can't do it. So what do you mean? He said, I heard you got Carl Moser all wound up. So, well, it wasn't me. He says, no, it wasn't you, but you were the one that started it without even knowing because they didn't tell you. Carl wanted an honest answer. That's why he said something to you. Yep. He says, and I can't stop these jackasses, my own son and son-in-law, from lying to people. He says, they just got it in their heads that everything will go easier if you just lie. And he says, it never does. He says, if they didn't learn anything from me, that's one they should have learned. Because one customer came in one day and said, you lied to me. You sold me a new unit. Yes, I did. You rebuilt it and took my money. Yes, I did. You're admitting to it? Of course I am. I'm not going to lie to you now. It's all gone underwater. You lying, filthy. Yeah, so what are you going to do about it? I mean, we're talking two old guys in their 70s looking at each other, and we're thinking they're going to blows. And the one old man we knew couldn't do much about it. And Edgar was like, yeah, he could do something about it, but he knew it wouldn't happen. He just went at him. You lying, thieving. He says, yes, I was. What are you now? He says, well, not that bad. And they ended up laughing and leaving. Friends for 40 years. Edgar had made a turnaround in his later years and came to talk to me about it, finding Jesus Christ as his Savior. He says, I found it late in life. I wish I'd have found it earlier for the boys. So I can't straighten them out now. I said, not much you can do with adults. And I was in my late 20s. Mid-20s, late 20s. So we had a lot of good talks, and that was one of the ones that he went and had to talk with them about. But you don't have anybody that's in your quiver or anybody that's in your circle in most cases. You end up with your butt out there in the wind. And when the managers don't back you up, and they tell you a story, you say the story, and then they turn around and hide. Or worse, you have a manager that's trying to make a name for himself, so he gives you bad instructions. And you go to the site, and when it fails, he runs around and tells them, see, I got to hire my guy because, and he did. Skiff tried for years to get rid of two of us. He wanted his people in there. He wanted young people. He wanted those that were going to be there for a long time, and they couldn't keep. And here's the fallacy of it all for the last 40 years. When these companies pull this crap, they can't keep the young kids there because they keep kicking the old guys down the road. And when they watch how the old guys are being treated, guess what? The kids don't stay. And they still, generation after generation after generation, they still don't get it. That is apart from trying to read the scriptures and get people to understand exactly what it says and stop playing games, that's one of the worst stupidity, brain dead, ignorant, multifaceted pieces of personal forced stupidity in my lifetime that I have seen. Generation after generation do the same lie, cheating, and stealing. They say, well, that's just what we were taught. That's a bad excuse when you're no different. I sat there on the phone when that moron Skiff called me the one time and said, well, we need you to come in. Why? To explain this to such and such because we're getting dragged into court. I said, of course you are. I already know. I said, what'd you call me for? I said, well, we need you to come in for the company. Ha ha! Said, yeah, well, I've already been contacted by the other guy and his lawyer. And I told him the same thing I'll tell you. And flat out, no, wait a minute. No, you wait a minute. He asked for substandard parts because he didn't want to pay Komatsu price. So you sold him substandard parts that were junk. And the failure he has there has nothing to do with the substandard junk that you sold him. I was there and you were there when I went through the whole proliferation of what happened with his engine. Somebody put something in there or got left in there. And I said, in my book, something got put in there because he had 20 plus hours on the engine. Something just left in there wouldn't have been dancing around like that. It's too small. So I said, whatever you guys work out, fine. But don't bother me because I've had both sides of you ask me to defend you. And you're both wrong. Why? They lied to each other. Customer didn't want substandard parts. You wanted Komatsu parts at IPD prices. Now, don't get me wrong. IPD, or was it KM something or other? Whatever company, it wasn't IPD. It was KMC, KMI, KM something or other. KMP, I think. And some of their stuff is junk. Absolute trash. I tried putting injector copper seals on some of the stuff. All of it was junk. All of them. I had to go back and get Komatsu. Total crap. The rest of the gaskets, they fit okay. But there were some others of the gaskets that were laminated. Gasket, steel gasket. And that was the gasket with a steel core. Seemed pretty good. They separated. Junk. So, but the guy, it's what the guy wanted. All the parts, it's just, what do you do with that? Well, that's my thing that I'm going to give you for my last commentary. Gotta go. See you later.